Day for the next day of sitting. Clerk.
Private Members Business Notice number 2, Urban Public Transport Project.
The member for Throsby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The motion before the House today is of critical importance to all Australians. Despite our bush heritage, Australia is an urban nation. 4/5 of our population and our economic activity happen in our cities. Australia's cities produce about 80% of our national wealth. Our great cities can continue to be our great strength, but only if we invest in them and get the policy settings right. Urban public transport is critical to the future of Australia's cities. Our quality of life, our economic productivity and how we deal with the challenges of the future, like an ageing population, climate change and the growth of Asia, all rely on our ability to get these things right. For more than 100 years, the unyielding trend in Australia has been towards increasing urban density. Over the next 2 decades, Australia's public transport usage will increase by 1/3. In many of our cities, including Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, we're already at capacity for the existing public transport networks. As a national parliament, with responsibility for our national interest, we cannot turn our backs on this task. Nation-building infrastructure is a shared responsibility. Labor has a proud record when it comes to nation-building and national infrastructure. Labor recognised this responsibility and Labor did something about it. First, Labor set up Infrastructure Australia, an independent process to assess Australia's infrastructure needs, that very same body that the new government is trying to dilute and tear apart. The task of Infrastructure Australia has been to assess and rank those projects that could best contribute to our economic productivity. In government, Labor committed to urban public transport since 2007, more than all previous governments combined since Federation. Labor created the first Ministry for Infrastructure and ensured that that ministry was in Parliament. Now, the shadow member for Infrastructure, the member for Grayndler, was indeed that first Cabinet Minister for Infrastructure. In 2011, Labor developed Australia's first ever national urban policy. In government, federal Labor committed $60 billion towards nation-building projects. This record investment went towards new, modern, well-planned transport infrastructure right across Australia. The critical point is that this investment included urban transport investment, which helped to make working people's lives easier, our businesses more competitive and the Australian economy more productive. Deputy Speaker, given the size of the challenge, Australia is entitled to know what the view of the Prime Minister is and what the view of the new government is to this great challenge in urban public transport. Well, this is what he had to say quite recently. We have no history, and I quote, "We have no history of funding urban rail, and I think it is important that we stick to our knitting, and the Commonwealth's knitting when it comes to funding infrastructure is roads." Where Labor had proposed to partner with the states to deliver nation-building urban rail projects, the Prime Minister, Mr Abbott, is focused on his knitting. He won't offer a cent in funding for urban public transport. Contrast this with our approach. The arm's-length Infrastructure Australia process, where economic productivity, not political pork-barrelling, was the centrepiece of decision-making, has been the major criteria and has seen 55% of Infrastructure Australia's nation-building money going on urban rail, distributed on the basis of merit. In government, Labor strongly backed vital urban transport projects, including the Commonwealth's single largest investment in urban rail, the regional rail link in Melbourne. Since the election of the Abbott government, Commonwealth funding has been withdrawn from a number of important projects that were in the last federal budget, budgeted for and should be being delivered. I cite some examples, 4 important examples. The Brisbane Cross River Rail Project. This is a tunnel under the Brisbane River which will deliver capacity of 17,000 additional passengers during peak times and needed because the existing rail bridge over the Brisbane River is about to run out of capacity. Then go south, the Melbourne Metro, Deputy Speaker, which Infrastructure Australia has assessed would increase passenger capacity on Melbourne's urban rail network by a massive 30%. Over west, the Perth Airport link, designed to ease congestion around the busy Perth Airport. And finally, an upgrade to Adelaide's Tonsley Park rail line. Deputy Speaker, Labor worked with state governments over many years to progress these projects. Without these projects, Brisbane, for example, will grind to a halt in 4 or 5 years, and Melbourne, Deputy Speaker, is almost there right now. These commitments followed Labor's investment in the Noarlunga line in South Australia, the Moreton Bay Rail Link, Gold Coast Rapid Transport and the Regional Rail Link. Melbourne's Regional Rail Link is a $4.8 billion project and a landmark urban infrastructure that will remove major bottlenecks in Victoria's rail network by separating the metropolitan and regional tracks. The Commonwealth proposed to contribute Regional Rail Link is $3.225 billion. The state would match contributions in the order of $1.582 billion. The fact is, Deputy Speaker, no cash-strapped state government will come up with nearly $5 billion in funding for a project of this scale. They cannot do it on their own, and they cannot do it without significant Commonwealth support and backing. Where Labor offered partnerships, the new Prime Minister offers nothing. Those officers know that this hands-off approach, this sticking to the knitting, is a death knell for urban infrastructure. They know that state governments lack the financial leverage to get these massive urban infrastructure projects off the ground. The Abbott government's position is nothing less than economic vandalism. It's an abdication of responsibility and a failure of leadership. For a Prime Minister who made so much in recent months about traffic congestion, about infrastructure, he made it an issue in the last election campaign. This approach, this withdrawal of funds, is nothing more than hypocrisy. I can only imagine the embarrassment of the new member for Lindsay. She must be deeply ashamed of the approach that is being taken by her Prime Minister and her Minister for Infrastructure. Her government's view is leave it to the states. But where does that leave rail commuters from Penrith or the Emu Plains? Instead of rising to this major challenge facing so many Australians, the Coalition is pushing this off to state governments to address their own. It's extraordinary. The Coalition is in effect saying that if you travel to work by public transport, your problems are none of the Abbott government's problems. You're on your own. Unlike roads, public transport does not attract the private sector investment. It's a proposition purely for the public sector. The problem of urban congestion in Australia's cities is in plain sight. Deputy Speaker, I think roads are important, but roads alone are not the solution. We know that one loaded passenger train can carry the same capacity as a 10-lane highway. The Coalition just does not want to help to pay for the solution. It's not just Labor saying these things. Transport experts agree. There is no reasonable rationale for the Prime Minister's decision to abandon the Commonwealth's funding of public urban transport. Australia's cities faced unprecedented challenges to ensure they improve their productivity, sustainability and livability. One of the reasons that Labor established Infrastructure Australia was to take the politics out of these critical infrastructure decisions. Prime Minister Abbott is in the process of putting the politics back. Deputy Speaker, there is a bill before the House that will do exactly that. National Party ministers look on infrastructure budgets as an opportunity to spend up big, to pork barrel in their electorates. Urban public transport investment has always run a big second to their favoured road projects. We cannot sit by and let this happen yet again. There is no justification for abandoning the infrastructure needs of our cities. It's just a political choice by those made opposite. Prime Minister Abbott is turning his back on this great productivity challenge. Prime Minister Abbott is turning his back on our great cities. Indeed, his recent promise in the recent election to be the infrastructure Prime Minister is turning out, Deputy Speaker, to be just as hollow There's a unity ticket on education. He might just as easily have said, I want to be the Gonski Prime Minister. I commend the motion to the House.
Just before you sit down, Member for Throsby, can you please formally move this motion?
I move the motion in accordance with the notice.
Thank the member for Throsby.